Well, good morning. We have a rather unstructured circumstance today. Dr. Schapiro and I are going to give 2 or 3 minutes of comments and then talk back and forth a bit, and then we're going to throw it open to the audience and any questions you might have. The subject, as has been indicated, is civility in the body politic. And I thought I might just mention, as someone who's been traveling the country talking about civility, and not from the perspective of so much of as public manners, is the meaning of the concept for American governance. And that brings me to the notion of the body politic. And you can describe the body politic as a sense of community. It's also in relationship to a community writ large, whether it be a city, a state, a country, and in American philosophical terms, all people everywhere, because the Declaration of Independence is a universal set of precepts. That is, that we have rights that are applied to all people, not based upon being given by a king or a body of people, but by a creator. And so, since we're all created, the assumption is that rights apply to everybody. Now, what I sometimes talk about in this context is that all of us in this room were, by definition in American philosophy, created equal with these great rights. But our governance was based on the notion that we also had many foibles, and that everybody had a foible, and therefore we made a government that was bifurcated, separation of powers, which we triplicated at the state, county, and city levels, all to constrain foibles of man. And so that the whole instinct was that we had this assumption that no individual could speak for everybody very well, and that nobody could find perfect consistency in an individual, a political party, or maybe even in a government and its policies. And therefore, the great challenge, as I see it, on this body politic issue at this time, is how do you take a multiplicity of views, package them together, and then respect the outcome? And what we have had in recent times, and we've had precedents in this in American history, is a real fracturing of our society, with words being used in ways that are, in my view, ahistorical and not particularly tolerant. That is, the difference between Dick Cheney and Barack Obama, in some ways, is that Dick used to be called a fascist, and Barack is called a fascist and a communist, often at the same time, by the same people. And so, if you think about these words in history, it frankly doesn't make great sense. If you think of these words in terms of America, they imply not just rival ideas, but a sense of enemy. And as a society, we've got to think of ourselves as a cohesive whole, and that is our challenge. And I'll just end with the notion that American governance was also premised on the notion that we'd have lots of different ideas, and that implicitly, and no one ever exactly said this, that argumentation is a social good. And that, frankly, if you take a period in modern times, the case for good argument has seldom been greater than the last few years, because in many ways, the best and the brightest in American governance, and by this I imply many institutions, all political parties, have to, in a sense, let the country down. We've had multi-trillion-dollar mistakes made by people in high finance and high governance. And so the case for an angst-ridden public is very high. But the case for an enemy mentality is very low. And so our challenge is to think through in a historical and philosophical way just where we are and how we should proceed from here. Dr. Schapiro. I've been told that this is a doctor of philosophy that likes to be called Morty.
This is true, Jim.
How do you proceed? And he's implicitly kind of putting it to me. He's wearing this very purple sweater, and there is
well, Jim, you know, I wear purple every day, actually. It's not just when we beat Iowa, though. I suppose that was 5 of the last 6 times we played, but I'm not even going to mention that. So yeah, it's my normal purple. He's a little upset. He's sucking it up very well, but we talked on the phone earlier this week, and we talked a little bit about the game, and let's move on. Look at him. So okay, let's get back. That's not civil,
no response.
Right?
No response.
Where's the civility here? So first of all, as Dean Harrison pointed out, I moved here. This is my 2nd year as president of Northwestern, and so I didn't know about the Chicago Humanities Festival. Jim, you probably did, but I didn't. And when I heard about it, I thought, boy, what a great thing to celebrate, the humanities. And I thought maybe I could be part of it. And then I saw that the title for this one was The Body. And I said, that leaves me out. There's no way in hell they're going to take a dorky little academic, Morty, here and put me in a session on the body. But then they cleverly, Jim, figured out a way, civility and the body politic. I thought that was a little bit of a stretch there, but you know, an opportunity to be here in front of you and a chance to be with a truly great American, a great leader, but 30 years in Congress, head of the NEH. It's a real honor for me to be here. As Dean Harrison pointed out, I'm an economist. I do empirical studies. I have a co-author here in Chicago, Mike McPherson, with whom I've written or edited 6 books on the economics of higher education. And you know, we've been doing work for 30 years on sort of economic returns to higher education. And so when people get asked, should you major in, you just mentioned, Jim, philosophy and history versus say the STEM fields, science, technology, engineering, math, or my field, economics, or should you go to a big research university or a small liberal arts college? Should you go public, private? Should you take a merit aid offer and go to a less prestigious school than a more prestigious where you're less likely to get a merit aid, only need-based aid? My colleague and I have done a lot of these empirical studies, so we do a lot of that stuff. And I want to talk a little bit about that because I worry about it. I worry that when people think about education, they don't think about civility and the body politic, nor do they think about enhancing aesthetic sensibilities, nor do they think about health decisions, voting behavior, and the like. They think about economic returns, and part of it is they're citing the stuff that Mike and I have been doing for the last 30 years. You're the head of the NEH, Jim, and you're not going to, I'm sure you're happy that the rate of return to higher education is at record levels now, and we've managed to survive the Great Recession very nicely in terms of rates of return. But do you worry a little bit that it puts it all in monetary terms, which means it's probably an individual responsibility in a family, not a more public responsibility? And do you worry that with the emergence of differential earnings from Wall Street versus the rest of the world, that some of our most talented young men and women are all too much? The irony is, again, everybody says we need more in the STEM fields versus China and India. I worry a little bit that we're sending too many kids, and certainly too many kids, to highly lucrative professions as opposed to the humanities. So you're the head of the NEH, so what do you worry about that as well?
Well, Morty's raised the concept of rate of return, and I want to put it in a different way of looking at it. If you look at the costs of not studying the humanities, it's pretty severe. And let me just give one example. If you don't understand your neighbor, and neighbors, for the last 2 generations, everybody knows the analogy of the world getting smaller. Our neighbors are now pretty distant from us geographically. And if we don't understand them, we might make a mistake or two. And these mistakes might be unbelievably costly in human life, in commerce, and in actual cost of government. And one of the analogies I make is to the United States Congress. We were in a war in the Middle East in 1991. And it was a war over the Gulf under George H.W. Bush. And I frankly found the case for that intervention to be compelling. But a decade later, in the wake of 9/11, I don't think 10% of the Congress knew there was such a thing as Sunni or Shia. And decisions were made of a given kind of nature in American governance about intervention that seemed out of touch with the history of other countries in the Muslim world, whether it be the French in Algeria, whether it be the Russians in Afghanistan, the Brits in a prior century in Afghanistan. In a way, whether it be America and Vietnam, that is, there are powers of words like nationalism that are extraordinarily high, and then there's subtleties to these conceptualizations when you look at parts of the world. And so the fact that America knew very little about the Muslim world, even though our economy in part derives from certain exports from that or imports from that world, and even though we'd actually been directly involved with military activity in that world recently, is rather amazing. And so lack of attention to this particular circumstance is very high. If you take other humanities, let's take the concept of philosophy and ethics. How many people think we've had a perfectly ethical series of decisions being made related to our own economy by people in very high powered positions? If we take American governance, and we have a political system that's being fractured today by money and politics, with both political parties becoming indebted to interest groups rather than to the people who vote. These are really very profound issues. And then if you just take the life of an individual citizen, are we going to be uplifted by an interest in literature, an interest in history, or are we going to be driven by other factors that have nothing to do with ways in which civilized values are transferred? And so my personal concern as head of an institution devoted to research in the humanities, as well as bringing relevance of the humanities to public life, is that this country makes a great mistake to shortchange the humanities. And I'll just end with one very interesting phenomenon. There is almost no area of higher education today in which the United States does not lead the world. And yet we are in very real danger of having that leadership eroded. And so my sense is we're going to have to pay more attention to this concept of humanities, and it applies to how we put priorities in government, but it applies much bigger to how universities put priorities in how they operate, how the American people choose to what they're going to study and what they consider important. And I might just say, as much as I am dismayed about a football game, Northwestern University is one of the bellwether American institutions. It's one of the bellwether institutions of liberal arts in the world. And as we think about these issues, we all ought to also remember there are things to be very proud of, and you happen to head one of those institutions for it.
That's very sweet. So Jim, you know, before I said the economic returns are really good now, and economists make a lot of predictions. And can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Economists make a lot of predictions. The amazing thing about being an economist.
Oh, it fell off.
Okay. Wow. I was wondering, I couldn't hear myself. I felt like I was sitting on myself, and I was sitting on my mic. So, you know, the economic returns, let me just step back just for 1 second, Jim, because it speaks exactly to your point, I think. In the old days, it was a cycle. What would happen is the return to college degrees, university degrees, would be really quite high, and then probably too many people would get those degrees before the labor market had the capability of taking advantage of people with that level of what economists call human capital, and the rates would go down, then they'd go up. So I graduated college in 1975. That was perfectly timed, the trough of the rates of return. I have a friend, Dick Freeman, who's a great labor economist at Harvard. And Dick wrote a book that was a very big, very popular book in 1976 called The Overeducated American, during which he argued that we had too many people going on for college, that the job market still had lots of blue-collar jobs, you didn't need higher education, and on and on and on. And that corresponded, of course, with the trough. So that was when, you know, you were praising philosophy, I think you said English, you said history. Well, a lot of those kids, a lot of those graduates around my year, graduated in the mid-70s, college graduates, couldn't get suitable jobs. And then what happened is we started a rebound, so we stayed in the bottom part of the trough. It was pretty flat throughout the 70s, and it went up and up and up. The interesting thing now, Jim, is that the rate of return to higher education degrees has pretty much monotonically increased since about 1978, 79. So right after Dick wrote that great book that there were too many people going on, maybe they listened to him or something, but it turned out to be the wrong advice because those returns, and now if you believe the Tom Friedmans and the rest of the world, we've outsourced a lot of the jobs to Bangalore and similar places, and you need higher education degrees. And so the economic returns are really, really high. But let me go back to Iowa here. Okay, not the football game, so don't wince, but one of the greatest economists and educators ever is a guy I know you knew, Howard Bowen.
Yes.
And Howard Bowen was not only president of Grinnell, he was chancellor of University of Iowa, and then Claremont Grad School. He even did a little stint in the 50s at Williams. A great person. When Dick Freeman was talking about the overeducated American, Howard Bowen in 1977 wrote a classic book called Investment in Learning. It was republished again by Johns Hopkins Press 20 years later, and with a new foreword by me and my co-author. So I'm not trying to sell books. We don't get residual, but you know, why did they reissue this book? They reissued the book because it truly is a classic. And Jim, I think what you'd find interested about your old friend Howard Bowen is that when he was talking about investment in learning, he almost never mentioned the economic returns here. He almost never mentioned. There's one chapter in 14 that talks about economic returns. Well, why? Because one, even though he's an economist, you know, the economic returns were really low when he wrote this book. This was during the trough. And the other thing is, as he says up front, he just wasn't interested in that. So I was just listening to the things that you said were important for educational outcomes. And he's talking about you know, social goals of higher education. He's talking about cognitive learning. He's talking about tolerance. This is in 1977. Creativity, wisdom, aesthetic sensibility, intellectual integrity. You mentioned integrity. Lifelong learning. He's talking about being better citizens. He's talking about leisure and health, using it better. He's talking about understanding the humanities better. He's talking about culture. He's talking about citizenship. And you know, people don't talk about those anymore, and mainly because the economic returns are so high. But here's one of your friends from Iowa. I think of everyone who's ever written about this, and I know you know this book, the most brilliant explication of these issues is really here. So given that, I know you agree, and you just said it beautifully, that the humanities and liberal learning is more important than ever, then why is it whenever you enter a recession, here's an article from the New York Times from February of 2009, and it's called, "In Tough Times, the Humanities Must Justify Their Worth." It's not that science needs to do it. It's not that, you know, engineering needs to do it. It's not that economics or math. It's the humanities. And this article goes on to point out something I hadn't really noticed, that if you look at the previous recessions, particularly the really bad recession in 81, 82 with recovery into 83 in this country, before this recent one was the worst recession since the Great Depression, you know, the humanities were decimated. They were decimated then. And that was in the days when we didn't have a big economic return. So what's the disconnect on America's campuses, Jim, when we have beautiful books like Howard Bowen, and why is it the humanities have to justify their worth in tough times?
Well, first let me underscore your premise. If you take the notion of civility and define it as I sometimes do, not about manners, but about ability to put yourself in someone else's shoes, to respect someone else's point of view, it's very interesting. This is not simply about public policy. This is about all life at all times. I mean, whether it be the dinner table with family, whether it be discourse with neighbors. And America seems to be bifurcating in many ways that have nothing to do with politics and that are deeply social. And so one aspect of the humanities is about putting yourself in someone else's shoes. And let me explain what I mean. You take a novel, you read about a protagonist and other characters, one identifies with one or another, or one looks at these people differently, but one learns lessons from these people, and that are the live human beings in novel form. And that is a great learning experience. And if one stops doing that, then how does one cope with the world? And the world is a sociological phenomenon, it's an economic phenomenon. How do you compete in international trade unless you understand how other people think? If you don't understand their history, their culture, their ways of doing things. And so the humanities are directly relevant to this jobs issue. They're also directly relevant to how we live our lives. And then they're directly relevant to, as some of the chapters that Morty just mentioned, whether we want to live a life that's a little uplifting in some sort of way. And so I think they're incredibly important. I'll end with that if you were to say what's the hallmark of our age, it has something to do with the word change and the acceleration of change. And until literally the last century and a half, virtually everything that happened in the world was related to something that happened before. And so a revolution was kind of like a spinning wheel, and now that wheel moves like it's on a cart. And so that means we're dealing with unprecedented circumstances, unprecedented decision making. And that's in our lives, it's in governance. And how do you deal with the unprecedented unless you learn to be a little bit of a type that can understand something to do with creative thought? And it's creativity that teaches one to put themselves in a circumstance and deal with a circumstance that we've never dealt with before. And you don't get this exactly numerically. And so you get this in ways that go beyond it. And if you take even the great scientists, Einstein used to say the imagination was vastly more important than knowledge. And he was living proof of it because he was in a math-dependent field of science called physics and considered the world's great physicist, but he wasn't a first-class mathematician. He was a first-class imaginist, and he did these thought experiments that were of novel dimension. They were just imaginative. And that's what, in a microcosm, we all have to do in our lives in obviously perhaps less imaginative ways than Einstein was dealing with, but that's what we're confronted with. And I think of nothing more relevant in this than the humanities.
Mm-hmm. So Jim, if I heard it right, your arguments defending the humanities and more broadly liberal learning were twofold. One was pragmatic, that if you don't develop empathy, you're not going to have the right, you're not going to be able to engage successfully in an internationally increasingly flattened world. Again, I'm an economist. I used to do consulting for the World Bank. Certainly if you believe Joe Stiglitz and Nobel Prize winner and others, that a lot of the mistakes that the World Bank and the IMF made, particularly in the 80s, 70s, 80s, into the 90s, was we didn't understand the history, we didn't know the religion, we didn't understand the culture, and on and on and on. We just basically tried to get the prices right. So the pragmatic thing is that if you don't have broad learning, there's no way you're going to be successful in policy abroad or in the country. But then you also talked about enlivening our lives. So I want to get back to that because there was an article, a front page article in the New York Times in May, and it was about college, obviously, and about what's going on to colleges and rates of return. And again, since I work in this, I was quoted several times in this, and I said something that was remarkably similar to what you just said, and I got hate mail from it. So this is what it was. So they asked me specifically about what happens, what does the economic literature suggest that if you go to college, but you don't graduate, do you still get some decent economic return? And if you believe that college is really a screening and you get a so-called a sheepskin effect, a diploma effect, and it's not human capital development, then you'd expect that if you go to, say, 2 years of college, but you don't get a degree, you can't prove to the market that, you know, you get the halo effect from graduating in Northwestern or Iowa or Yale or Princeton or Amherst, right? And that you lose. But the reality is, and the empirical data suggests, and this is what they asked me, that my studies and other studies, that even if you get another year of college, even without getting the special extra return from getting a degree, there's still some positive return. So that's what they asked, and I should have shut up about that. But then I couldn't resist, Jim. So I then went in and I said something remarkably like you said. I said, anyway, it's not just the economic rate of return. So the reporter said, it's not? And I said, no, it's funny coming from me, but it's not. And I said, there are other great things, and I was quoted in here in the New York Times saying, things that I thought were pretty innocuous. I said, you know, it improves voting behavior, it makes you a better citizen, it allows you to make better health choices. And then I said something that led to me being widely mocked, and I said, and it also contributes to aesthetic appreciation. So, okay, I never should have said that, God forbid. Because, you know, they came back to me and I got, you know, you never hear from anybody who likes anything you say. You only hear from people who think you're a moron, right? And I got a lot of that. You probably know, but I do. But so I started getting these letters, and the letter said, oh, you're such an elitist. You know, don't you know there's a terrible recession? Don't you know that the Northwesterns of the world are charging $50,000 a year sticker price? You know, don't you know that it's only an elitist like a president of Northwestern will talk about aesthetic appreciation in the New York Times in an article about economic return. So, you know, I want to hear what you think about that. Is it an elitist view? The last thing I'd say is I just did a parents session because it's Parents Weekend up in Evanston. And one of the parents came up because this mother had said that the son heard me give the welcoming to the new class of 2014, and you know, back in September, and I said then that if you can only take one course, you know, we're on the quarter, you take 48, but you only take one, I would say of the courses I took as an undergrad, the one that has had the biggest impact in my life wasn't math, because I never stopped taking math. It sure as hell wasn't economics. I never stopped taking economics. It wasn't even philosophy, although I was a philosophy minor. It wasn't art history, which was actually my other major. It was a course called From Bach to Beethoven. It was a music appreciation course. And this mother came up to me today and said, you know, my son heard this and is in a music appreciation, and boy, was that great advice. So, I mean, is that, again, elitist? You know, the world's in this terrible economic situation. Do we have to defend broad learning on pragmatic grounds, or can we just simply say it makes us better human beings? Howard Bowen has 3 chapters about becoming better human beings. So what do you think about that?
Well, I think that's quite profound. You've answered your question rhetorically. But,
you know, Jim, I'm a university president. You were a congressman. This is what they teach us, right?
But there are always mixtures in this, and we can't leave out that the discipline of work matters too. There was once a successful Iowa businessman who gave a talk at the University of Iowa Business School on receipt of some sort of Businessman of the Year award. And he began it with, I'm going to answer the age-old question of whether to be successful in business, it's more important to be smart or hardworking. And he told the story of a kid in his high school class who was the least student in the class. They didn't even know if they'd give him a degree, but he was a really nice kid, and they did. And he always wondered what happened to this kid. And anyway, the kid started a little neighborhood roadside stand, and pretty soon he had a little restaurant in town, and then he had a restaurant 30 miles down the road, another one 30 miles the other way, and pretty soon he had the biggest house in town. And this head of a major corporation asked him what was the secret of his success, and he said, well, it's very easy. He said, I make a steak sandwich, and I have what I call a secret sauce. He said, it's not that secret, but I call it that, and it cost me $1, and I sell it for $3. And he said, you'd be surprised how much money you can make on a 2% markup. And, now, the reason I mention this is that one has to be very cautious of being a little elitist. But at the same time, life is more than the size of a house. And when we think of our own great philosophy, if you remember, Jefferson talked about pursuit of happiness, and these involve values very different. And by the way, Jefferson was a great taker of thoughts from the Enlightenment and from John Locke and Hume. And I always thought his one addition was pursuit of happiness, and it ends up he took this from an obscure Swiss natural philosopher named Burle-Marchais. But everything about us, we took the great values of so many centuries from so many civilizations, and we were the country that was the greatest recipient in some ways of foreign aid in the history of the world. And much of this was thought, which then we have refined and made our own and refined in different kinds of ways. Well, maybe we ought to end this and throw it open to the audience, if that's right.
Absolutely.
But I would like to end with one notion, if I could, and I
Please.
want to take off at the very beginning, and that relates to the subject of sports. I sometimes, when I entered political life as a candidate, used to make these one-on-one analogies between sports and politics, very competitive, result-oriented, preparations in between. And then it dawned on me a year or two ago that I was dead wrong, that the distinction between sports and athletics, or sports and politics, is that sports has a higher ethic. And I don't mean this exactly as a joke, but if you think about it, in sports, there are referees to throw flags if one clips or is offside or commits a foul, or balls and strikes are called by umpires. In politics, there is no political pundit out there that doesn't tell a candidate in the close of election to go negative. And so one is rewarded by negativity, by being offside, by clipping. Whereas in a football game, the team is disciplined. If a coach at Northwestern were to teach his kids to try to harm someone, to kick, to cheat, it'd take you a millisecond to fire him. In politics, we hire that type. And so this is something I think the American public, when we talk about the body politic, has to think about. Do you want to say something, or should I just throw it open?
I think we can throw it open.
Okay. Does anyone have any queries they want to?
So I have a microphone, and I'll be going to people, and we've got our first question up here.
Okay.
Hi. It seems to me that the common thread that runs through a lot of this discourse is some form of instant gratification, whether it's the degree we pursue, our personal choices with regard to finance, and the direction of the country. Are we making increasingly making short-term decisions rather than long-term decisions through all of this?
Well, let me talk about public, and maybe Morty can talk about private.
Yeah.
And very interesting analogies, and they're almost one-to-one. In politics, people do look to next elections, for sure. And they do this in often very short-term ways. If you take states, and I don't want to make Illinois a model, so let's make another state a model. But to get through budget years, people cheat a little bit. I mean, for example, mathematically, you take an issue like public sector pensions and liabilities of states. States started to assume that whatever pile of resources they begin with in pension funds, that they would get at least 8% returns for long periods of time. Well, no one else in the world can guarantee that. And all of a sudden it looks like we have over $1 trillion in liabilities of all the states and communities around on just pensions alone that are underfunded. And that's based upon short-term decision-making to claim one has a balanced budget in a given year. People take from these funds. At the federal level, lots of things are being done to shore up things in instantaneous gratification. Let's do another program, let's cut another tax, that put things out of whack with long-term. And so we all understand that every young person in America is coming in with a huge amount of debt on their neck based upon a short-term gratification in politics, either for lower taxes at a moment or higher spending at a moment. Now, Morty can comment on that and maybe point out some things on what corporations do in terms of their decision-making.
I've never been in the real world, Jim. Thank you.
Oh, but you're an economist. Well, you're an economist. That's true. You have.
I am an economist, but an economist in the tower.
Okay.
So I never really left it. But I know there's a world out there because I see the Wall Street Journal. I don't read it, but I see it occasionally in airports. But let me say something about it. I think that short-sightedness really speaks to some decisions. You know, it goes back to the New York Times. In tough times, the humanities must justify their worth. That's incredibly short-sighted, unbelievably short-sighted for the two reasons you gave. One, Jim, is that it's important to enliven our lives. That's one of the most important things. And if we don't have an appreciation of literature and we don't have an appreciation of the arts, then we're less as human beings. And the other thing is your pragmatic point that we're better in business world, we're better in the not-for-profit world, we're better dealing with other countries if, God forbid, we know their language and their history and their religion. And I think that higher education institutions acting in an expedient way because, you know, there's less, you know, pushback, you know, all the obsession about science. Science is very important. But, you know, I never hear people talk about, you know, we're losing our lead against India and China because we're, you know, gutting language programs or we're gutting philosophy departments or we're gutting linguistics departments. You know, but that, I think, actually is more, has a higher price over the next 20 or 30 years for U.S. than anything else. So that's, in my mind, is the high, what economists call it a high discount rate, you know, the inability to delay current gratification to invest in the future. If we're not giving the right kinds of resources to the humanities and more broadly to liberal learning, we are going to be like the rest of the world or worse. This is one of the great things we understand in this country that they don't understand in India, China, or anywhere else.
You're going to take care of this. Go ahead, please.
I've always felt that civil discourse begins with the mutual agreement that you're after some larger truth that each individual may not have possession of. But how can you begin a discussion when one or more of the parties is only interested in self-aggrandizement or power grabbing? I mean, how do you even start a conversation when that seems to be the case to me right now?
Well, if that's a circumstance that's universal, it's obviously a dilemma. And let me go to political philosophy. A philosopher named Hobbes argued that in what he described as a state of nature, everybody could only think about their own self and their own vested interest and their own perspective. And therefore, you couldn't get out of this state of nature because where life was guaranteed to be nasty, brutish, and short. On the other hand, John Locke, who was the philosophical godfather of Jefferson, argued that human beings were a little larger than that and that they could see each other's different perspectives and therefore could come to balance them. And civil society could be based on a circumstance where you could have rules or laws governing disputes and third-party arbitration. And that was the difference between civil society and the state of nature. And the American system is based upon a Lockean view that can occur. And we all know people that are short-sighted. We all know movements that appear to us to be short-sighted, although from their perspective they might think that the other is short-sighted. But America is rooted in the concept that we can think things through. But we do have periods that have brought out lesser instincts and other periods that have brought out what Lincoln called the better angels of our nature. My own view is that the Lincolnian view will basically prevail in the end, but we've got to be very, very concerned for the other occurring, and that's one reason you have a body of laws. And the body of laws are there to protect against too short-sighted or too self-interested perspectives. Fortunately, if you take American history, these laws have moved historically in a really profoundly progressive direction. And it happens that tolerance can be reacted against, and we know that, but from a legal protection point of view, great steps have been made, symbolized by people coming to the law schools of this nature here at Northwestern to protect the rule of law. And then if you want to, because we're looking at everything we think isn't going perfectly, if you take polling data, for example, of young people, it's really impressive on these tolerance-intolerance issues. Young people are more tolerant than their parents and grandparents on two very profound issues: the subject of race, the subject of sexual preference. These are high-button issues in a historical, sociological way, and yet as a society we're moving more tolerantly. And there is a sense of many Americans, maybe too much so, that's can be a debate worthy of respecting, but the fact of the matter is America is becoming, on the whole, more tolerant, even though there are aspects of this election that a conservative might think there's kind of a liberal intolerance, a liberal might think there's kind of a conservative intolerance, and my personal view is that everybody should respect the notion not only that someone may have a different position, but there is real reason for angst. I mean, I really mean it when I say this was a year that there should have been a really powerful debate, and that we should understand that argumentation is a social good, and that if you don't have argumentation, you have dogmatism, and in politics, you have tyranny. And so the fact that we can argue these things out is still excellent. The fact that some of us might think that some sides, one way or the other, are from our view, not taking a particularly decent perspective, that's worth talking about. But it isn't worth going against the rule of law, which is progressive.
If I can just add from the viewpoint of America's campuses, it is staggering how high a percentage of what goes wrong on our campuses is related to the tension between taking a very diverse, often not inclusive, but a very diverse community where people are used to the protections of the First Amendment and then try to continue to have civil discourse. I mean, it's just, I've been in this business, again, I joked, I don't know anything about the real world, but I know the academic world, and I'll tell you, so many of the things that go wrong are related to that. So yeah, you're talking about the laws, Jim, and we do our own laws, and whenever we do have, we're thinking now at Northwestern about an honor code or something, and I'm saying, don't make it a speech code. And it makes it extremely difficult. We have people on our campuses from very different backgrounds in terms of sexual orientation, obviously, but political, race, ethnicity, you name it. And we bring them all together and we put them together in the dorms and we say, just make sure you believe in civility. And then, on a Saturday night after people are drinking some beer, there it goes out the window. And then on Monday, it's on my desk. What do you do? And I'm a very First Amendment guy, and I believe very strongly if America's campuses don't allow freedom of speech, you're not going to see it anywhere. But it is just fraught, I'll tell you. And so many of these are young, 18-year-old undergrads, and they're all together for the first time with independence. And they're quickly going to say all kinds of things. And every day, you should see the list on a Monday morning of the things that, the outrages to the community standard over that weekend. I, for one, have always felt, well, if students can work it out amongst themselves, and occasionally you cross the line and then you bring them together. I don't know how many times in my academic career, I've moderated a panel of aggrieved students, and you know, after a big protest about whatever it was, we had a blackface incident a year ago on campus and Halloween. We had vandalism in a religious place last week. I mean, it never ends. And you know, it's really hard to know where the freedom is protected, as you said, by our nation of laws, and whether you recognize that there are different standards that should be put in place on America's campuses. Do you have any thoughts about that? I could use help after all these years.
Let me tell you, partly because I've been talking about civility, I was invited to one of the California university schools where they had an outbreak of swastika painting on some dorm rooms. And I was asked to address the student body and to go through the history of what the swastika means and what it means to the person that might be behind that door, what it might mean to someone living someone else in another campus anywhere around the country that reads about this. Yeah. And these are really significant things. And just as people are becoming more tolerant, that doesn't mean all the time, and it doesn't mean that there aren't minorities that are less tolerant. Right. Now, the most vivid image I have in my life on this issue was I was in in high school, my senior year, standing in at the end of a football practice in an open shower with like 25 shower heads, and the guard in my football team that I'm standing next to tells an anti-Semitic joke. And next to him is the tackle, who's Jewish. And Dick says to David, "David, how can you say that? You know, I'm Jewish." And David looks up and says, "Oh, you're what a Jew is." And the point is, he had no idea what he was saying. I mean, none whatsoever. I mean, these things, where did he pick this up? He heard something from his parents. He heard, you know, some sort of joke somewhere. He had no idea what he was talking about. And I can't think of a more human environment than this one. And it was just bizarre. And both of them then slapped each other in the back, and the one said, "I'm sorry." It was really profound. But
well, when it works, it's nice.
It does. Yeah, right.
See, I don't deal with that on Monday mornings.
Yeah, I know. I hear.
I just deal with the other stuff on Monday mornings, and it really is tough. It really is tough. You're constantly pressed into whether you institute more laws to ensure civility, as if we could do it, versus, you know, the First Amendment.
Yes, sir.
A lot of hands.
Who has the microphone?
Okay.
Okay, and then if you'd come down to the front, there are a whole lot of people in the front. Okay, go ahead.
One of the most interesting books that I've read in the past 20 years was Bob Putnam's Bowling Alone. Are you familiar with this book?
Very much.
Very well.
Yes, it's basically arguing that we have real true physical barriers to civic engagement that's happened for very real reasons over the last 50 years, including the car, the television set, the backyard deck in place of the front porch, driving our cars into our automatic door openers, going home, turning the television set on in the morning, getting up. So my question is what do you see as the true cultural and physical barriers to engagement in daily life?
Well, there are many. Some have made the analogy that we used to be a porch society. That is, in middle-class America, people would sit on their porch and engage with what's happening in the street, and now we're much more enclosed. Putnam argues that we're losing all sorts of social discourse in many ways. We bowl alone instead of as a community. And then you go to all the modern communication technology, and we all know that we're seeing, in some sense, back to 19th century newspapers. That is, the news is being projected by some of the outlets in a kind of a ideological dimension instead of a more even-handed dimension. By the same token, there's a lot of good news. I mean, I suspect most of this audience begins or is part of everyone's day is now looks at a computer, which is kind of a lonely thing, and yet the contact that the computer allows is awfully universal. I mean, and from a news gathering perspective, if one chooses to, can get perspectives from the best and the brightest in almost every field from an academic perspective on an incredibly timely basis, and news from far parts of the world can pop up on our screen instantly. And so the country, in my mind, is being right now bifurcated in one very distinct way, and it's between those that choose to only look at one set of perspectives, and they have that choice today, and those that have a more open and broader look at what's happening. And this is a real social division that's occurring. And it's kind of the bowling alone thing at large, or enlarged. And it's a troubling phenomenon. Now, my personal belief is that in the long run, the multiplicity of sources is going to win out over the narrowing of sources, but it may not, and it may not over periods of time. And we're seeing this writ large internationally, where some parts of the world are only looking at one perspective. If you take the extremist, it's this country called North Korea that only gets one slant in the most incredibly slanted way imaginable. Then you take many countries with a large Muslim population that are looking kind of at one way of looking at the world, with a little bit of widening. And then you take America that has some of the same tendencies, although not near to the analogies of either of these other two parts of the world, and you have to wonder. And we have to think about ways of reaching out and trying to get people in our own society and in other societies to look broader. And that's the only answer that I know of to this dilemma.
One of the nice things, Jim, I think, as you know, at University of Iowa, Northwestern, and similar kinds of schools, we don't have gated communities, right? We have dorms, we don't have gated communities. You might come from one, but when you come there for 4 years as an undergrad, you're not going to be living in one. And one of the best stories I ever heard was back when I was still president of Williams, and I met with a parent who was one of the principals of Blackstone, right? You know, one of the great, you know, companies in Wall Street. And I met with him, obviously asking for a donation, and I was talking to him a little bit about it. Well, this is my job, right? And the son, I don't know if the son had gone to Trinity or Dalton or, you know, or one of the Hill schools, you know, I mean, Riverdale, Fieldston, Harrisman, one of those schools, certainly. It was one of those schools. And I was talking to the dad about his son's experience, and this is a story he told me. He said, you know, you put him in freshman year with a kid who was actually undocumented. He was from Salinas. His parents were migrant workers, or at least his dad was, and this kid ended up through Questbridge in one of these great programs at Williams. And at first I was worried this guy was going to say, you know, and he said they became absolute best friends in the world. And they said you couldn't be more different than, you know, submarine as a verb, you know what that means in New England. It's submarine in the Hamptons and the whole thing versus documented worker from Salinas, you know, his son of. He said, but you know what? The kid ended up getting his citizenship. And this was now like 3 years later. The kid was a junior. And my son drove him down to New York to be sworn in as an American citizen. And he said, that experience with everything else, you know, that meeting other kids and studying abroad and getting to know faculty, you know, all that pale by the one chance my son will ever have in his life to have a best friend from 180 degrees different from his background. And that breeds, as you said, that kind of empathy you were talking about before, that breeds civility. So, you know, Putnam's right about gated communities and all that. That doesn't happen on our campuses. It's one of the few places, in fact, because it happens in country clubs. It happens almost everywhere. It doesn't happen on America's campuses.
So this will actually be our last question. Thank you.
Could I get you to comment on civility in the current political situation? It seems to me increasingly we have parties that are not compromising and having the dialogue and argument that you're talking about, but are carrying on continuous campaigns that last for multiple years. And we have at the same time appeals mostly over the heads of the compromise in the political bodies to citizens. At the same time, we have our news sources shrinking in size, going out of business, number of major news weeklies Newsweek's gone, and I think the Time is merging. So we've had big problems with our newspaper here locally. And I think that the national news media has an outlet. So you've got an increasingly uneducated public that is being increasingly asked by or played to by politicians, including kind of some provocateurs. So could you comment on that civility and body politic and how you see that resolving in the current situation?
Well, we don't know in a way. I mean, if you take the current circumstance, we all know the candidates who won the elections. We all know the power shift between the political parties. But we don't know whether people are going to be able to work with each other or not, and whether you're going to have a constructive governance arrangement that occurs afterwards. That is the great unknown. I would only like to comment in a more concerning way to me, because we've all noted the language of incivility that's occurred. But there is also a very uncivil, civil language that also takes place. And what I mean by that is, we now have in American politics at many different levels, people that have been put in office representing rather narrow views at the relative edges of American politics, with the great unrepresented part of America now becoming often the middle. And that could be a majoritarian middle, which is a very unusual phenomenon based on how parties choose candidates in small primary election settings. But the civil speech that has an uncivil outcome is often related to money. And let me give just a conversational aspect of my life. It is legion the number of times as a member of Congress I'll be walking over to vote with a group of colleagues, and someone will run up and say, Joe, you know how much we supported you in the last election. We really want to even support you more in the next election. By the way, there's a vote coming up that's very important to us. We hope you understand. And by the way, how's your wife or your spouse? And this is very civil conversation, but the implications are totally uncivil. And what I mean by this is, if civility is putting yourself in someone else's shoes, and a representative should be looking at their constituents and their constituents' points of view, and yet they've had kind of a monetary quasi-contract with people who have influenced the people that voted for them. You have a very uncivil situation because you're not listening to your constituents, you're listening to the interest group. And to me, this is one of the most troubling aspects of American life. We have very little corruption in American politics, but massive conflicts of interest. And these conflicts of interest are of a nature that affect how in heaven's names we represent people. And then you have, I mean, this is a truly symbolic week. I mean, I really want to stress this, or several weeks in particular, not just the election, but new policies of the Federal Reserve Board, which are very significant. And then we have a group earlier this week and early next week that's going to be setting forth macroeconomic ways to put a budget in a little more reasoned stance. And then you ask yourself, can a conservative who's pledged never to raise a tax, can a liberal who is committed to almost every interest group on spending, make a decision in your interest? And by your interest, I mean the interest of the individual American citizen. We as a society have a real dilemma on how our political system is working out today. And it's a different dilemma than we've ever had in our past, in magnified terms. Sometimes there are, in philosophy terms, there's difference in degree, and sometimes there's difference in degree becomes so much it becomes a difference in kind. And that is what we're facing in American politics. We have a different in kind political set of challenges and political set of relationships of elected representatives to the voters. And we're going to have to really think this through.
A quick word about the second part of the question about journalism, the demise of print journalism. You know, obviously one of the great things about being president of Northwestern University is we have Medill there, Medill School of Journalism, along with the other great ones in Missouri and Columbia and elsewhere. You know, it's one of the preeminent journalism programs, obviously, in the world. And there are more student interest in journalism now, you know, broadly defined. Now, it's not maybe people who think they're going to work at the Trib or a Newsweek or anything, but they're going to work. And they're going to work doing blogs, they're going to work in internet more broadly, they're going to work in any number. There's really an explosion in journalism. It's very interesting, because I was unaware of that 16 months ago until I showed up in Evanston. But it's more important than ever. It's more important not just for civility, but because everybody's an expert, a Wikipedia expert, right? But you need people who really can distinguish between fiction and fact. Particularly when you're talking about contributing to a safer, more energized, but a better educated world. You know, we're out in Doha, and one of the programs we have, as I know you know, Jim, is we're out in Education City in Qatar, in Doha, teaching journalism with a deal with Al Jazeera. And if you ever want to make the world safer, you know, given how many billions of people throughout the world, they're not listening to Al Jazeera English, they're listening to the real Al Jazeera. So as we try to make more and more inroads into that, it leads to a much more civil and a much safer world. So the good news is, I think actually media, and specifically journalists, are going to play a larger role over the next decade in terms of these important issues than they did in the previous one. But I want to thank Jim for being here.
Well, thank you. Well, I want to thank you for being here. And thank all of you. Thank you, Morton. Great. Thank you.